Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of the Husch Blackwell Energy and Natural Resources Group webinar series. I'm Chris Reeder, and I'm a partner with Husch Blackwell in the group. And today we're going to have two speakers present on some legislative issues, federal climate and energy policy update, and Texas energy legislative recap. Let me go over some housekeeping type items before I introduce our two presenters today, especially for those of you who are tuning in to this webinar series for the first time. At the bottom of the audience console, you'll find multiple application icons that you can use today. If you have any questions during the webinar, and we encourage and are soliciting questions because we're going to try and get to as many of those as we can, please submit those by using the question box. And like I said, we'll try to answer those today, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we can't get to it, we'll try to answer those later on through email. Okay, so we're going to have a PDF of the slides, presentation slides, and that'll be available in the resources folder. We've been approved for continuing legal education credit in several states, and so if you want to report those hours, you can click on the CEU icon, which is also at the bottom of the screen. We're also going to send a certificate of attendance by email to you tomorrow, and also there'll be a recording of the webinar that we'll send. And then we're going to ask that after the program, we're going to ask you to complete a short survey, and we use those survey results to put together our future programs. Okay, so that's it for housekeeping items. Let me turn to introducing our speakers. I'm very pleased to have join us Kyle Gilster and Chris Hughes. Kyle is the office managing partner in our Washington, D.C. office, and he practices on governmental affairs and regulatory work, campaign finance, government contracts, and election law. He advises industry representatives from groups, companies, and associations with legal services across the public policy spectrum. And he's also a member of our affiliate entity, Husch Blackwell Strategies. Chris Hughes provides clients with sophisticated counsel and regulatory and legislative law, corporate communications, and public risk strategy. His practice primarily involves managing public risk for electric energy companies and other large corporations through agency rulemaking, contested cases, and legislative advocacy. He's heavily involved with all aspects of the competitive electric market in Texas and issues related to electric generation, renewable energy, transmission infrastructure, and retail competition. Chris, likewise, is also a member of Husch Blackwell Strategies. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Kyle. Kyle's going to give you his presentation, and then going to save up a couple minutes of time and read any questions that have been directed towards Kyle. And then Kyle's going to need to leave us, and then we'll turn it over to Chris and kind of repeat that sequence. So Kyle, if I can ask you to go ahead and get started with your presentation. Thanks.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is well, healthy and well. We have a PowerPoint today that we'll use kind of as a guide, but candidly, a lot of things have been happening within the last month very quickly that aren't necessarily reflected in the PowerPoint that I think are important to emphasize. So let me kind of start macro, and then kind of we'll go micro and give you an update as to where kind of things are at right now. Kind of I'm controlling the slides here now. You know, let's start extremely broad. Obviously, the cabinet selection, all the cabinet folks went through. Jennifer Granholm, the former governor of Michigan, is Secretary of Energy. She has testified multiple times in front of Congress on appropriation bills and otherwise. Candidly, I think she doesn't per se have an energy background, but she does have a level of gravitas with the president within the administration. and obviously has a lot of stature, and I think you're seeing that. One thing which is very important to point out, probably one of the most underreported stories of the year, is that a lot of the administration more junior appointees have not yet got confirmed by the Senate. There are probably a lot of reasons for that. You know, always in the first year of an administration, things are a little bit slow in terms of appointments getting through the Senate. But candidly, they've been slower than normal this year. I would attribute that just because there's been a lot going on between, you know, the events of January 6th and all the attention on the commission for what happened on the Capitol on January 6th, as well as, candidly, COVID-19. COVID-19 continues to dominate in our nation's capital in terms of bandwidth with the Delta variant. You know, you may have seen most recently that President Biden has maintained the travel restrictions through Europe and much of the world. That is where the attention has been. And because of, you know, COVID-19 and what happened with this kind of the siege on the Capitol on January 6th, there just hasn't been enough bandwidth to get a lot of the rank and file Senate confirmations through. And that very much includes the Department of Energy as well. So wanted to focus a little bit on who the players are. In D.C., personality matters sometimes as much as substance. Joe Manchin is the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. There is not probably a more important senator in Washington than Joe Manchin in terms of kind of where he's staked out. And I'll talk a bit more about it later, but the most important word to know in Washington, D.C. is reconciliation. Reconciliation is a way legislation is moved with only 50 senators needed, plus Vice President Harris as a tiebreaker. There are currently 50 Democrats in the body, 50 Republicans in the Senate, with VP Harris as the tiebreaker. It makes Senator Manchin so pivotal in terms of trying to get anything through. Frank Pallone from New Jersey is continuing as the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So those players, in particular Manchin, are vital. I'm going to breeze through these pretty quickly, these policy key issues. I'm not going to kind of belabor what's here. The most important thing to know is that in late March, Congress passed and was signed into law the American Rescue Plan legislation. That was over $3 trillion. As you know, last year we had the CARES Act passed, signed into law. This was an additional $3 trillion that really candidly continued to focus on COVID-19, SBA, PPP, and didn't have a significant at all, really, energy footprint, the American Rescue Plan. So candidly, again, COVID-19 is kind of, I think it was President Biden's intention to probably move something quicker as it relates to energy, but because of the pandemic, he has not been in a position to do that, but instead has had to focus on other economic issues and small business issues. So, you know, in terms of climate issues, you know, kind of the top bullet there is obviously about rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, and the president wants to do a $1.7 trillion federal investment in green technology. That's still an enormous priority for the president. But it's hard to push for $1.7 trillion when you're having to push enormous amounts of aid through for just general economic aid because of the pandemic. So, you know, in terms of energy industry impact, there's been a series of executive orders. What President Biden has been able to do is push forward a series of executive orders to reverse different Trump policies and institute new regulations. Won't belabor here, but you have the slides there for to kind of go through as to what EOs the president has pushed through. In terms of energy impact, I mean, the key thing that obviously President Biden is pushing for is kind of this clean energy standard to push people away from carbon by 2030 and push them towards clean energy, enormous investment in clean energy, deployment of clean technology, and making environmental justice a priority. Let me continue to go through this. In terms of the energy industry impacts, I talked about the clean energy policies. FERC continues to be quite robust in its activities, so I think that's important to follow. What I wanted to do now is talk a little bit about the infrastructure package and the execution of the clean energy policies for President Biden. So right now, stepping back, there has been a bipartisan discussion and negotiation, which probably everybody has seen, as it relates to infrastructure. President Biden wanted to get his clean energy efforts and his efforts on climate change and clean technologies and clean energy to be inserted into this infrastructure package, which is about $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package. From the perspective of clean energy, unfortunately, it has not been included as of today, and that is highly fluid as it relates to kind of what we call hardcore infrastructure. And the hardcore infrastructure is roads, bridges, levees. So we have a highway bill that has to be authorized before September 30th. And as part of that, they're pushing through what I call hardcore infrastructure. And currently, they're still negotiating that package literally as we speak. There's about 21 senators of the 100 who are trying to negotiate in a bipartisan matter that $1 trillion hardcore infrastructure package. They've not yet released text. They've not yet got to a formal agreement. I hadn't seen anything as of this morning. And I think probably the biggest takeaway from today's presentation right now is I think it's unlikely at this point that if they do strike a deal on $1 trillion kind of hardcore highway infrastructure package, that it will not include the clean energy provisions that the president is pushing for. That is fluid, and that could change. They're having enough problems coming to an agreement on the highways, bridges, and roads. There are other peripheral things like broadband they're making an effort to get in as well. So here's how I think it'll play out is if they do reach an agreement on kind of a $1 trillion bipartisan package, they will have to do what is called a cloture motion. And a cloture motion needs 60 votes to pass. They cannot move the hardcore, well, there are questions about can you move the hardcore infrastructure bill by itself through reconciliation, but instead would probably group it with a larger package, which would include what is called kind of soft infrastructure. So bottom line, I think we'll know more by end of the week. Usually Congress uses this, they want to go home for the August recess and do their district and state work period. We'll see how that plays out. But I think over the next week, they'll either reach an agreement, then the Senate will try to vote on it. If they don't reach an agreement, they will then roll the hard infrastructure package of about $1 trillion into what is called a softer infrastructure package. President Biden coined the term soft infrastructure. It's kind of a new term, and then that could be up to a $4 trillion bill. And then they would move that $4 trillion bill not through regular order needing a cloture vote, but instead trying to go through the reconciliation process. And as part of that $4 trillion, $3.5 to $4 trillion, I do absolutely expect that the Democrats would include in part of that clean energy infrastructure, a clean energy standard by 2030, as well as maybe potential modifications of some tax incentives. We will see if that plays out to encourage clean energy. That provision, which is a reconciliation, is expected to have both spending provisions and also provisions on the tax side. Potentially could increase corporate income tax, could increase the capital gains tax, the stepped up basis on capital gains tax. So that is something to watch. If they do not, I do not expect a reconciliation bill in any way to get through in July or August. That's more of a September kind of thing. The Senate has to go through a budget reconciliation process before they can push it. Bottom line takeaway is I think it's likely there will be some kind of reconciliation package in September that will include up to $4 trillion of infrastructure changes, including soft infrastructure, which will include money for caregiving, money for child care, and also money for clean energy, in addition to the money for hardcore infrastructure of highways and such. Moving on, we talked about the different clean energy initiatives, extension of tax credits, and such. So One thing also I wanted to convey, and then I wanted to open it up for questions, is also wanted to focus on the appropriations process, and I may have some questions on that as well. So another thing that effectively slowed up Congress this year was typically in a standard year, non-president, non-inauguration year, the president releases his or her budget in typically February. And that's the budget for fiscal year 22. The president, as you know, the federal fiscal year is from October 1 to October 1. So fiscal year 22, the appropriations process starts October 1. The president didn't release his budget this year until May or June. He had different tranches that he released, and kind of a broader release and a more narrower release. The reason that's important to know is that has slowed the process down for the appropriations process. In the president's proposal, he included $46.2 billion for DOE programs, which is about a 10% increase on the enactment level from the prior year. So clearly the president, his emphasis on clean energy is an enormous influence. Bottom line is this. The House is kind of, there are 12 appropriation bills, one of which is called Energy and Water. Energy and Water did pass out of the Appropriations Committee last week. It would have been on July 16th. They included overall, and remember this includes both energy programs and water. If you count both energy and water programs both, they had about $53 billion, which was about $1.5 billion over the prior year of what was enacted, which is shared between both DOE and energy. But clearly the president, or I should say, the House Appropriations Bill put enormous amounts of money in for clean energy and clean energy technologies. So where does that go from here? The House wants to move some appropriation bills to the floor, called probably mini buses. And part of those mini buses is you'd maybe break up those 12 appropriation bills into 2 or 3 or 4 packages and moving those through. It's unclear. I think it's probably likely that those mini buses may go through more in September than before the August recess. That remains to be seen, but that's where I think it's going right now. Bottom line, for our purposes today, in September, they're going to have to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government past September 30th. Unlike, fairly recently where we were concerned about a government shutdown, I do not fear a government shutdown here, but instead they'll extend all the federal government, including DOE programs, from September probably to sometime later in the year, November or December is what I would expect. And that would include all the DOE programs. The Senate Appropriations Committee hasn't even really started their work. They've done hearings. They've had Granholm testify, Secretary Granholm, on DOE issues, but have not been able to move forward on any appropriations process. The appropriations process is going to be very challenging this year in light of it's challenging to get 60 votes, and they need 60 votes to move forward on an appropriations bill for closure. They cannot move kind of a standard appropriations process under reconciliation, unlike the $3.5 to $4 trillion hard and soft infrastructure packages that I mentioned. I will stop there. Chris, you may have a question for me. The group may also have a question for me, and happy to talk more. Bottom line is, in the first 6 months of the president's administration, just because of so many other issues, COVID, what happened on January 6th, DOE issues are still very important to the president, but federally they have taken a backseat to everything else that Congress is wrestling with. And candidly, now with the resurgence of the Delta variant in many places across the country, that may continue to dominate Congress into the fall. So, Chris, happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle, for that comprehensive presentation. So far, we don't have any audience questions concerning your presentation. There's still time to get those in, however, so please do. But
I have a question.
Understanding that, sure, go ahead. I was going to ask a question too, but go ahead.
Kyle, this is Chris Hughes. I just wanted to find out, what is it that with regards to the larger overall infrastructure, meaning if they end up in whether they end up in reconciliation on both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure or not, where is Manchin on the overall, the extra $3 trillion or the total $4 trillion, depending on how it goes? Where is Manchin on that second infrastructure piece, and for that matter, Senator Sinema as well?
Yeah, great question, Chris. Senator Manchin has been very circumspect and has been non-committal on what he would support in terms of a $4 trillion infrastructure package. There's some significant changes on Medicaid that they want to go through, that Senator Sanders is pushing for an expansion of Medicaid. He's had reservations on some of that. So he has been very circumspect. Clearly the stuff on clean energy comes out of his committee. And Senator Manchin, West Virginia is still a state that is fairly significant in coal production, which is an interesting place to have Manchin, because here you have Manchin as chair of Senate Energy and Natural Resources from West Virginia, and you have President Biden pushing a strong clean energy agenda, but ultimately it's going to probably need some level of Manchin's blessing. And here, the president is trying to push clean energy additions into the soft infrastructure package because he was not able to get it into the harder infrastructure package. Manchin very well may, he has effectively veto power. I think he may accept some of the clean energy changes. He may not accept all of them, but he has absolutely kept his powder dry, and that's probably the biggest development to watch in September is where is Manchin. You also mentioned Sinema. Sinema from Arizona has, she's kind of been a partner with Manchin and saying, I have significant concerns on the size of this package. I do think a lot of Sinema's focus is more on the healthcare side than the energy side. Senator Sanders wants to include Medicaid, to include visual services, hearing, a variety of other things which have not been included in Medicaid as of so far. One thing I saw was that Senator Sanders' Medicaid proposals have been budgeted to be about $1 trillion. And maybe that number is high, but even if it's anywhere close to $500 billion to $1 trillion, that's effectively a fourth of the bucket of a $4 trillion plan, which makes it harder to get other things in. I do think, to end my answer, I think on clean energy, I think the clean energy changes may be more likely to get into the soft infrastructure package by reconciliation than all the healthcare changes. So hopefully that answered the question, Chris.
Yeah,
Kyle, I had another question. I had a question too, which was, of all this infrastructure spending that you're talking about, and thinking that a good bit of it at least might actually get approval, what sort of appropriations impact on DOE would one expect for the next fiscal year?
Great question, Chris. I think what's important to note here too is treat this infrastructure package, which could be a $4 trillion package, as effectively like a supplemental appropriations, or at least par supplemental. It's really at the same time, it's an authorization bill, it's a partial appropriations bill, and a tax bill all at once. So that $4 trillion is effectively not off budget, but is not, the fiscal year appropriations bill still does its own thing and is considered separately. Clearly, I think that clean energy appropriation spending is probably as well positioned in DOE as we've seen anything since the Obama administration. I expect ultimately, if they can get a larger appropriations deal done, I ultimately expect it to have very strong and robust spending for DOE. The president proposed a 10% increase for DOE spending in his fiscal year 22 appropriations budget. You could likely see something of that percentage of an increase, potentially, maybe even 5%-ish, maybe a little bit higher for DOE spending. So if you're involved in the clean energy space and the DOE space, I do think it's going to be a favorable climate for DOE spending. The hard thing right now is DOE needs to get people confirmed to carry out the wishes of the president. So happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Doesn't look like we had any audience questions, so looks like we are in a position now to turn it over to Chris Hughes. Thank you, Kyle, for your participation and your excellent presentation. And so anyway, goodbye to Kyle, and hello to Chris Hughes.
Hi, Chris. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to preface this presentation with this, that we're still in the process of actually figuring out how to implement the bills that were passed in the last legislative session. As you all know, also, the legislature is actually in session, or they're technically in session. They're not really doing a whole lot since the Democrats haven't been there for the last 3 weeks. But so a lot of this stuff that we're going to discuss today is there are still a lot of question marks about how it will be implemented and what the actual impact will be. But we'll try to give some color to it as best we can. We're going to start with, basically, as you all know, Winter Storm Uri. Anybody who was in the electric industry probably went into the beginning of the legislature thinking that it was going to be a pretty light session on electric issues. There wasn't much to, in the interim that needed to be dealt with. It'd be pretty much tweaking around the edges. And then Winter Storm Uri occurred, and all hell broke loose, and we ended up with energy basically being the predominant issue in the legislature. The predominant policy issue. There were a lot of other political issues that took up a lot of time, but this is the primary policy issue. There were basically 3 buckets of bills that were responsive to Winter Storm Uri, and I'll try to identify which bucket I think they're in when we get to each one. SB 3, which was probably the biggest bill, I'd put it in the reliability bucket. There's some of these bills are aimed at reliability. Some are aimed at dealing with the cost of the storm, and some are aimed at emergency response or storm response and how to better coordinate in emergencies like the winter storm. So SB 3, which is on the first slide, was an omnibus bill that was purported to address issues that were under the jurisdiction of the Public Utility Commission and the Railroad Commission. That's because during the winter storm, it wasn't just electricity. There were lots of natural gas infrastructure issues as well that played into it. That's why the PUC and the Railroad Commission are the primary focus of SB 3. You've got probably the biggest one, and this comes out of the winter storm that occurred in 2011 as well, where resource weatherization was a key to that storm and a key to the outages that we had in 2011. I don't think we had quite the gas facility issues we had as we did in Winter Storm Uri, but nonetheless, there was a weatherization discussion in 2011. The legislature ultimately determined to make it optional for the generation companies to weatherize their resources. In this bill, it is going to require weatherization, and there will be monitoring, enforcement, and penalties at the PUC with regards to that. There was also an effort or some thought that maybe there ought to be reimbursement for those costs to some of the generation companies. Those bills did not pass, so it remains to be seen how the decisions made by the generation companies as far as getting the weatherization done and how they're going to pay for it, whether those costs will be passed on to customers. I assume that they will in market prices, but there was no formal reimbursement mechanism passed. So there will be a requirement to weatherize. It remains to be seen how fast that can get done, and we'll see how the monitoring and violation fines, how that takes hold. I assume there's going to be a rulemaking at the PUC to determine that process, so we'll keep tabs on it. There's the creation of an electric supply chain security mapping committee to address gaps in the critical gas supply and to electric generation. This was a major issue during the storm. Some facilities, some gas facilities, were not on the critical infrastructure list. So not only did some gas facilities freeze up themselves, but they were also, some of their supply interruptions were due to electricity being cut off because they had not been put on an infrastructure list. So this committee is designed to, between the PUC and the Railroad Commission, to figure out what are those key infrastructures, and make sure they're on the list, and make sure that they get priority during these types of weather events. Another provision that's in SB3 is the ancillary services provision, which would require competitive procurement of ancillary services to meet the reliability needs during extreme weather conditions. Some viewed this as primarily a target on renewables. There were other bills that would have required renewables to or change the way renewables had to deal with procuring ancillary services because of their intermittent nature. Those did not pass. It remains to be seen how, if entities are required to procure ancillary services during extreme events like the winter storm, remains to be seen how they're going to actually procure those ancillary services if it's a supply problem. I'm not sure if you have 25, 30, 35,000 megawatts down. I'm not sure where those ancillary services would be procured and whether they would actually be available. There's also an emergency pricing program in this bill, which would propose to regulate various market prices during certain weather events. This is what was referred to during most of the session as market-based solutions, and these solutions are to address the high prices that occurred for almost 4 days. Rather than using more regulatory ways to control pricing, these pricing events or these pricing proposals are what most in the legislature referred to as market-based solutions. And you'll see in the summary at the end that one of the mantras was, and one of the concerns with most of the market participants was to not throw out the competitive market totally, and not to, it's been a good market for us for 20 years, for 15 years, and so let's use market-based solutions to tackle this at least first before we start with regulatory solutions. In the cost bucket, HB 4492, which allowed competitive market participants to securitize certain default charges and exceptional ancillary services costs due to the storm. This would be in the cost bucket and how to deal with what the overall cost to the market. And I'm going to let Chris Reeder address this issue because he's as he says, neck deep in it right now with some of his clients and has a lot more closer understanding on this bill. So, Chris, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, happy to jump in briefly. 4492 was a legislative response to a couple of different phenomenon that have really plagued the market coming out of the storm. One of which was that a lot of the market participants who had obligations to Ercot have defaulted on those. And as we know, Ercot is basically a pass-through organization, so that means Ercot in turn is not able to pay the totality of those other market participants who provided additional ancillary services or additional energy during the storm. So that's left kind of a payment deficit on that end. The other phenomenon, of course, is the extreme run-up in prices coupled with additional Ercot charges, both for ancillary services and then reliability deployment adders, has really impacted retail customers and along with them a lot of load-serving entities as well, such that it's either led to their default or it's put a lot of financial strain on them. So 4492 is one of two bills passed that seek to address that. 4492 provides for what's called a debt obligation order that Ercot may seek from the Public Utility Commission, authorizing kind of extra regulatory, if you will, financing. In the first instance, Ercot can be authorized by the Commission upon application to obtain up to $800 million in financing intended to cover the defaults that some of these market participants made to Ercot. The objective there is to try and mitigate against some of the uplift that Ercot would otherwise have to assess in order to be made whole. The specter of having to uplift all this default balance is really hanging over the market and affecting its competitiveness and attractiveness to investors. So, part one, if you will, of 4492 is enabling Ercot to obtain that sort of financing. Ercot has already filed an application with the Commission to be authorized to have this sort of debt financing, and it's anticipated that the Commission's going to take this up within the 90-day time frame allowed for that, in which case it would issue an order sometime in October. Ercot proposes to allocate around $300 million of that towards just sort of funding the present defaults. The remainder would either be for servicing debt, the cost of the debt obligations, or to kind of reimbursing itself for some congestion revenue receipts that were used to pay market participants that had provided services. So that's pending. And then the other half of this, kind of part two, is it's a little difficult to kind of parse through, but it's for uplift financing, in which Ercot kind of acts as a financing entity via the obligation of additional or the issuance of additional securitization bonds or instruments of that nature up to $2.1 billion, which is to create a fund that load-serving entities can access to finance their obligations to Ercot that arise from a couple of different sources, one of which is the ancillary service charges that exceeded the $9,000 per megawatt hour cap. The other is for the reliability deployment adder charges, all of which occurring during that particular week of the ice storm. So it's sort of like to set Ercot up as a conduit to obtain favorable financing terms, which load-serving entities can utilize to kind of mitigate the impacts that it's going to impose on them and their customer loads. As to both of these methods of finance, the legislation provides that Ercot, through the Commission authorization, can charge market participants for the repayment of these debt obligations. So in other words, to repay the lenders. In the instance of the $800 million for the default, that would be assessed to all wholesale market participants. And then on the $2.1 billion for the uplift financing, that's assessed on load based on formulas that the Commission will have to approve. But there are opt-out provisions that would enable some of the MOUs or the co-ops to be able to opt out, as well as transmission level customers to the extent that they've fully paid their invoices. As I've said, there are proceedings seeking debt obligation orders as we speak. The Commission is handling those, and so this should be wrapped up within the next couple, 3 months, and hopefully that will help Ercot to get back to a point where it's being able to address the defaults to it, pay those to whom it has obligations, and then help to address some of the harm out there in the market that came from some of these very high charges. Sorry, Chris, that's kind of lengthy, but that's the gist of 4492.
No, it's very detailed. I knew it would be lengthy because it's a complicated issue, and it's one that requires somebody who has eyeballs on it basically round the clock. So thank you very much for that. Kind of in dovetailing on a very similar to the same issue that Chris was just discussing is SB 1580, which allows electric co-op boards to securitize extraordinary costs and expenses associated with a winter storm. While the bill says allows the co-ops, it actually the text of the bill requires that if these co-ops have debts or owe money to Ercot for operations during the storm, they're actually required to securitize. Those charges for securitization will be allocated among all the that co-op's customers. One of the the most obvious entity here that will be dealing with this is Brazos Electric Co-op, who filed bankruptcy almost immediately after the storm. And because they're in bankruptcy court, it remains to be seen how all of these new requirements on the state level, the securitization, the payment of their debts, the fact that SB 1580 would prohibit those who do not pay their obligations from participating in the market, and for Ercot scheduling them. It's not clear what that would do to their customers or how that'll be dealt with, one, from a state regulatory standpoint or from a state standpoint, but two, also how it would interact with the orders coming out of the bankruptcy court. So that's another one that needs to be watched, and I think that we've already heard that perhaps at least Brazos itself is not quite sure yet if they're going to be able to do securitization or if they're going to choose it. But I think that since the bill requires it, if they have debt or if they have obligations owed to Ercot, it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out. SB2, I guess there's another bucket called the oversight bucket, but SB2 changes the Ercot board requirements. Let me change the slide. And implementation of Ercot rules. It requires that the protocols, bylaws, and enforcement actions have to be approved by the PUC first before they're implemented. Remains to be seen, but this could be cumbersome, but we'll find out. Board members must be Texas residents. There is some concern that this could limit expertise. Obviously, a lot of folks who are in Texas that are experts in this field could have conflicts serving on the Ercot board. So it'll be interesting to see how these board seats are able to be filled. One of the other issues is that Ercot will continue to have ex officio board members, meaning the chair of the Public Utility Commission, the chair of Ercot, and then the OPUC, the General OPUC Council, the Public Utility Council, will serve as a voting member. The other two will be non-voting members, and then there'll be 8 more members appointed by a selection committee made up of the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House. The fact that politicians will be electing 8 of these members may or may not make the board more political, but if you combine the selection committee made up of elected officials, you combine that they have to be Texas residents. It's going to be interesting to see who ends up on this board. As you all may know, or some of you may know, the current board has been selected from market participants or market groups, reps, TDUs, generators. Each had a vote, and then there were independent members as well. This will be quite different, and it'll be interesting to see if it becomes more political. SB 2154 is another oversight bucket bill. It increases the Public Utility Commission from 3 members to 5 members. Through the years, it's been thought that moving it from 3 to 5 members would allow the members to meet more frequently without running afoul of the open meetings law, because on a 3-board panel, 2 members is a quorum. So we're going to have 5. There's only 3 currently appointed. The commissioners obviously must be Texas residents. It's a full-time job, so I'm not sure how they could be non-residents. At least 2 of them must be well-informed and qualified in the field of public utilities and utility regulation. Both Commissioner Kobos and Commissioner McAdams would fit that bill. They both worked in and around the industry for a while. The other requirements, the old requirements, are still in place, which the other 3 members could be filled through different criteria: government experience, practicing attorney, CPA, or a professional engineer. Chairman Lake could fit into this category, having been over at the TCEQ for the last few years. SB 398. Now we're getting to kind of more the types of bill. This type of bill is one that's you usually see during the legislative session. It's not really storm specific, although self-generation did become a bigger issue during the storm. So this provides for sale and leasing of distributed renewable generation resources, reduces legal barriers to owning self-generation, requires certain disclosures by a seller or lessor of that equipment to residential or small commercial customers, prohibits cities from prohibiting the installation of solar generation as long as they meet relevant reliability, power quality, safety guidelines, and as long as they are compliant with homeowner association requirements. It defines circumstances where distributed generation of a grocer may be deployed and sold as backup power in an Ercot area without customer choice. This goes to companies like H-E-B and Walmart, who are building more and more, putting more and more distributed generation on their stores, and to the point where they do at times have excess power. HB 3648 requires the PUC and RS and the Railroad Commission to establish a process to designate certain natural gas facilities as critical electric customers or critical gas suppliers during emergencies. This goes to the issue I was talking about earlier, where as customers they may have been cut off and it affected their ability to actually supply gas, there's also the fact that a lot of these natural gas producers did not know that they needed to request to be put on a critical infrastructure list. So this will set about rules so that these facilities can be designated as critical and priorities during load shedding, so that they are on a priority list to not be shed, and it gives the discretion to the utilities, the municipally owned utilities and co-ops, to prioritize the power delivery and restoration among those facilities. HB 17 prohibits cities from banning certain energy types or fuel sources to be delivered to end-use customers, or imposing additional charges in utility service, especially in the permitting process to new development or construction, based on how the energy is produced. I would refer to this as the anti-natural gas bill. It's to prevent cities from favoring renewables over natural gas in the permitting or building process. SB 415, a version of this bill was filed last session as well. It allows a TDU with prior PUC approval to contract with the PGC, or power generation company who owns storage, to obtain reliability services in circumstances where construction of traditional distribution facilities is not cost effective. This bill also has in the past, it has been proposed in order to clarify or further strengthen the prohibition that TDUs be allowed to own generation. I think the generators have pressed to make sure that that's clear, and that the PUC can't take action without the statutes being changed to allow TDUs to own generation. So this bill further solidifies that prohibition against TDU ownership of generation. It does not grant PUC authority to allow TDU ownership of storage, and the bill doesn't apply to MOUs or co-ops. The TDUs have to solicit proposals for these contracts, and the PUC will determine whether the costs of the contract are just and reasonable during those TDU rate cases for the purposes of setting their rates, and the contracts are limited to 100 megawatts or less. HB 16, this one was probably the easiest to write and pass. It prohibits reps, aggregators, and brokers from offering wholesale index products to residential or small commercial customers, and it defines the wholesale index product as direct pass-through of real-time settlement point prices determined by Ercot. These are obviously the contracts that are all based on clearing prices, the day-to-day clearing prices. It requires additional notice regarding the expiration of fixed price residential contracts, and it requires reps to roll fixed rate customers onto a month-to-month default renewal product that can be canceled at any time without a fee if they fail to renew the existing contract or switch to a new provider before the expiration of the current term. SB 760 imposes mandatory language in solar lease agreements. These are utility-scale solar projects regarding the removal of generation facilities and the restoration of the property upon decommissioning. With the proliferation of utility-scale projects, clarifying these rules became more important. They require a lessee to completely remove all devices related to the facility and fill each resulting hole. If requested, the lessee must clear, clean, and remove any road constructed by the lessee and any rock of a certain site excavated during the process. Agreements must include evidence of financial assurance to secure removal, and it applies only to agreements after the effective date of the law. So to summarize this session, and this really is more specific to the effects of the winter storm and reliability going forward, I would say the bills passed to address the storm were designed to use market-based tweaks and tools to prevent reoccurrence while still protecting the competitive market. They did not venture into regulated solutions. They were discussed, and I'll mention that here in a second, but they did not rise to the level of a vote in committee or on the floor. It could be argued that a lot of these bills amount to either intrusion or regulation that one would consider in conflict with Ercot's competitive market design, which, as most of you know, is energy-only payments, low-cost resources that have kept prices low for the most part in comparison to other markets, and tight reserve margins and scarcity prices designed to keep generators in business and making money. None of the bills seem to address what some believe is a substantive shortage of dispatchable generation. Some acknowledged that they believe there was a shortage of dispatchable generation or thermal generation, if you will. Others did not, and argued quite forcefully that it wasn't a resource shortage. It was the ability that the resources that we had just could not get delivered. The response to the storm and the apparent shortcomings of the market was as much a political exercise as a policy debate. Obviously, lots of market participants have different views as to what the cause was, what kind of market they want going forward, and politics certainly played a role in the policies that were actually discussed. One of the most notable storm response proposals that was out there, but was dismissed by the legislature or maybe postponed for further review, was for an out-of-market regulated emergency generation reserve. That would have been the construction of facilities that did not participate in the wholesale market but were there for emergency use only. There was a lot of opposition to this from most market participants and other stakeholders as well. Sierra Club comes to mind. And the reasons for the opposition varied fairly widely among those stakeholders. There have been several generation shortage alerts since April. This, I believe, has highlighted the fact that actual generation shortage or dispatchable generation shortage may actually be a key culprit and may have been a culprit in the storm. Time will tell if the bills passed this year will have any real impact on spurring dispatchable generation growth or market stability. I will note that after the legislative session and before the special session began on July 8th, Governor Abbott sent a letter to the PUC and directed the agency to take aggressive regulatory actions over the market to address the problem beyond what was done during the legislative session. Those included streamlining incentives to build adequate and reliable sources of power, allocating reliability costs to renewable generation, maintenance schedules for generation resources, and also transmission construction in regions where there may be transmission constraints or created an inability for power to get to market. I think a big question with regards to the governor's letter is, does the PUC actually have the legal authority to take any of the actions that are suggested in the letter? And if the PUC does it result in any litigation at all? So that remains to be seen, and we'll obviously keep an eye on it. There's a lot of deadlines that the Commission has over the next few months that were created either by legislation or by some of the governor's recommendations or requests. So they've got a lot to do in a short time, and we'll probably know a little bit more by the beginning of next year. So with that, I'll just take any questions.
Yeah, Chris, we've only got a couple of 3 minutes. One question I know we wanted to get into, though, was speculation about there being electric items, electric agenda, electric reliability questions that were put on the call for the special session, but that didn't happen. Do you have any perspective or insights on that?
I had been, I think we all were hearing the same rumors that that it would end up being on the call at least a couple of weeks before the special session began. I think for a number of reasons, the governor ended up feeling that the letter to the commission and directing the commission to explore these recommendations and hopefully take action was the perhaps more direct route. I think obviously the political will around the Senate, the House, and taking on these issues again, and basically taking on the issue again prior to even implementing the bills that were passed during the regular session. But I think it's a lot of it is the political will to actually take it up at this time again. Obviously, everyone will be watching in the summer and see what the rest of the summer and see what happens with supply and see what happens with the reserve margins. But I know it was a lot of us were girding for it to be on the call, and when it didn't happen, we were somewhat surprised. But obviously, I think the governor's letter to the PUC was the alternate decision that he ultimately took, and it was probably because members in the House and Senate and others in the state probably there just may not have been the political will at this time to take it up, especially since a lot of the bills that were passed in the regular session had not been implemented.
Yeah, and there's more than a year involved, and he could always call another special session if it seemed like the need.
They're going to have to come back. They're going to have to come back in into September or early October anyway to do redistricting. So there'll be another special session. Obviously, I don't think they want to put a whole bunch of items on a call where they're going to be dealing with redistricting, but it could be done if necessary.
Well, we got to carve out time to deal with certain universities switching athletic conference too. That's an important public policy issue as well. So let's not forget that. Chris,
yep.
I think we're pretty much out of time, so I'll get that zinger in and then shut it down. There were a couple of questions that we had received weren't able to get to, and we'll try and answer that by email. So anyway, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Kyle, if you're still listening somewhere. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope this was really helpful to you. As a reminder, been approved for CLE credit, so make sure to click on that icon. You'll get a certificate of attendance tomorrow, as well as a recording of this webinar. And also, we really hope you'll answer our survey. We do use those to try and gear our future programs towards what our audience members think would be most helpful to them. So anyway, that's it for today.
And I'll answer these questions. I'll get on this deal and answer these questions by email.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Anyhow, okay, so we're out of here. Everybody have a great day, and we appreciate your attendance. Thanks a lot.